Good afternoon, good morning, depending upon where you're located. One of the things that I'd like to do is welcome you to the webinar today, PeopleSoft and Social Engineering Attacks. One of the things that I do want to touch base on just at the beginning is just a little GoToMeeting management. So we do have everybody on the webinar muted. If you do have questions, please use the GoToWebinar control panel. It's normally on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can submit questions that way. You can also always email info@appsien.com to get additional questions answered as well. So with that, I'd like to get started on the webinar today. My name is Greg Wendt. I'm the Executive Director of the Security Solutions here at Appcien. I almost said Gray Heller. But what we're going to kick off with is a little bit of an agenda. So I'm going to do a quick introduction of us as an organization. I want to talk about the current landscape, a lot of the issues that are hitting organizations now and today, the challenges with the existing security models out there, and how you can go about protecting yourself against all of these social engineering attacks, because it really will boil down to a layered security model of what you need to put into place. So with the introduction, just a quick introduction of Appsien and who we are. We specialize in solutions for the PeopleSoft space right now. One of them is on the UX side. So what we do there is we allow you to have that cloud-based user experience without moving there. It makes the PeopleSoft system engaging and brings it into a nice consistent user interface. When we talk about the contextual security, this is our application security platform, which we'll be talking about mostly today. So, we do transform, modernize, and secure the PeopleSoft applications. We do have over 200 customers globally, which really allows us to have a cross breadth of what's going on in the world. We've got a lot of customers that are dealing with GDPR from a compliance issue, so you're talking about dealing with, how people are attacked across the globe, whether it's the same type of scenarios that occur across the globe from social engineering and all of those types of things. So we also are a member of the Oracle PeopleSoft Customer Advisory Board. We're one of the few vendors that's a member of that, and we look at that relationship very fondly. As I said, my name is Greg Wendt. I am the Executive Director of the Security Solutions here at Appsien. I've been here about 4.5 years now. Before that, I've got 20 years on the customer side. So my first upgrade of PeopleSoft was actually version 5 to 7 way back when. So before leaving my last job, I did all of the upgrades to 9.2 on HCM and finance. So I lived in the world that you guys live in for a long time before coming over to the vendor side. So I look at it a little bit differently than a lot of people do, because I have contextually lived in your world. So let's go ahead and get started. Looking at just some of the broad customer base, you can see some of the different customers we deal with, and a lot of what you'll see, and I'll talk about it today during the webinar, is I've done a lot of security reviews across the spectrum, so across all of these different industry verticals. And when you look at a lot of them, whether it's government, commercial, higher ed, a lot of them are seeing the same issues, regardless of what end vertical they're in. From a security perspective, a lot of the attacks are the same. A lot of the initiatives are the same. So it isn't, not necessarily that unique when you talk about it from a security footprint of what people want to do. So I'll bring in a lot of contextual-based examples from different security reviews. Obviously, I won't tell you who, what, when, where, and why, but I can talk to some of the different points that have come up across different organizations. So let's jump into the current landscape. So, and this is kind of just for an example, of something that's going on out there. Deloitte was hacked. It wasn't really a big, huge hack or any of those type situations. But one of the things that you'll notice was they really boiled it down to the fact that somebody hadn't implemented multi-factor authentication on an admin style account. And when you look at your cyber insurance policies, if you have one of them, most likely what you're going to find is there's a due diligence clause in there. Due diligence really tells you, as an organization, you have to be keeping up with security. I talk to some organizations inside of security reviews, and what they'll tell you is, well, we have a cyber insurance policy, and we'll deal with the breach after that. Well, what's going to happen in that situation is the person after you is going to deal with the breach, because you're no longer going to be there with that type of mindset, because a lot of times the policy policy isn't going to pay out because you as an organization haven't done your due diligence. And multi-factor would be one of those situations of talking about due diligence. And there's a lot of reasons why there's enterprise initiatives into putting multi-factor in place, especially when you're talking about, big ERP style applications that hold a lot of personal data and can cost the organization a lot of money if there is a breach. When we look at, who's responsible for the breaches and what occurs, right now, there seems to be a much larger trend of outsiders. This kind of goes back and forth. This comes from the Verizon data breach report. This goes back and forth over the last several years. I've been tracking this, and it's ranged probably anywhere from like 50 to 75% inside outside. So it's almost been equal versus, a little bit larger right now on the outside side. The nice part about it is the things that you'll put into place to protect these can protect against both sides. So that is one thing that's very nice. But when you look at the tactics that they use, look at 81% of hacking-related breaches leveraged either stolen or weak passwords. That's a very high amount. And it's because, as computers have gotten faster, these dictionaries of passwords out there, people store and use the same password against every website that they have and all sorts of things like that. So, and a lot of times it really is the systems themselves with how they're implemented and how they're leveraged that can cause issues with that implementation as well. So if you're implementing, if you're going outside the firewall for the first time and you're accessing PeopleSoft and it's the same user ID and password that you use for email and you're not using multi-factor, there's a good chance somebody's going to fall for something and you're going to end up in trouble. That's what that scenario really boils down to, is having a really good security posture for being able to defend against that. And also the social attacks. So it really is a blend of a lot of different situations, but it is boiling down to passwords and the security and the people giving away their passwords in a lot of situations. So when we talk about data abuse, one of the things that I like to talk about, I like to bring this into, a lot of different conversations, because when you think about the data abuse and what happens in a social attack, there's all sorts of things that people can do by mismanaging an account. Sometimes they may take data out, they may put it on, they may store it in their email, they store it in an Excel spreadsheet. They do all sorts of things like that will allow, a different attack vector against the type of data inside of their system. One of the things that I like, especially to think about with a PeopleSoft system, is we've got a lot of scenarios where organizations will take a full copy of production and they will put it within their development, staging, and test environments. The issue with that really boils down to, now what you've done is you've rippled through all of that data within other application sets that might not necessarily be protected the same way. So it can lend themselves into a lot of privileged and data mishandling. For example, I did a security review for an organization and they had every one of their development systems public on the internet and they were full copies of production. So, when you talk about things that are unique, that's really unique. Not a lot of organizations are going to step into that. It's something that, you really don't want to do as an organizational perspective. It's a bad idea. So when we talk about, going through that was something they changed after the security review, but it was just because all their applications were public to begin with. So they just thought it was the same thing from the development stack. So you've got to look at and think about multiple different ways to protect all of your systems and all of your data. When we look at, somebody getting a hold of the data, this also kind of goes into data abuse, but it also stems into the fact of understanding when somebody gets a hold of your system. So when we talk about a social engineering attack, what I really see in this is, how long does it take you as an organization to figure out that somebody is in your system? Can you figure that out in a short period of time? Or is it something that has to be done over weeks and days and months, if that makes sense, to try to understand what was done or that somebody was actually inside of the application set? So, we look at it multiple different ways, trying to make sure that access was done. And when you look at it, it becomes very difficult to trim down and understand the difference between, an abuse or another scenario. And it can take months or weeks to be able to do this, and in this situation, you can see on the graph that it's months or years. And if it's taking you years to figure out what's occurred from a security perspective inside of your applications, that's obviously not a good security profile to be sitting within. Talking about that, it's like, do organizations really take that long to be able to, figure out what's happening? I went through a different security review talking to an organization, and what they told me was, after a potential breach, and it wasn't really a breach, but it was a social attack. Somebody had given up their credentials, and somebody got in and access to the system. It took them, in the range of 1,000 hours to figure out what was done. 1,000 man hours to figure out. So if you think about that, that's half a year. So you're easily into the months window. So it's difficult to try to figure out and track back what's going on, inside of the system, because often not, when you look at ERP style applications, it's difficult to track and figure them out. And if you have multiple systems where you do have production data, say dev, test, stage, and production, then you often set up those environments differently. Your development environments, you really don't have any logging or auditing turned on, where production does. So, and it really, another difficult situation is to understand the difference between a view and an update. There's a lot of times where maybe you can have triggers, something like that, that'll tell you when somebody has changed data, but when somebody's viewed data, it becomes very difficult to see that particular thing. So it really does cause issues when you're looking at months to years to be able to understand what's going on inside of your system. So let's take a step back and let's talk about the challenges of existing security. And what this is really going to do is it's going to kind of dig into a lot of what I've been working with and talking to different organizations on those security reviews. So when we talk, this is coming from the Cisco annual cybersecurity report. One of the things that I find most interesting about this report is a couple of different things, and they're the first couple of bullets that we'll cover off on. But 56% of security alerts are investigated. That's roughly half. And if you think about that, I kind of come from a different school of thought. Rather than, necessarily capturing everything or 100% of everything, I want to capture the events that I really know about and that I want to see, that I'm concerned about. For example, some of our customers might choose to log different events. Well, if it's an event that doesn't have any sensitive data and something like that, to where it's really mundane, do I really need to know about that event? Do I really need to have that event tracked and alerted on? No, probably not. What I want to alert on are the things that are important, maybe direct deposit, those type things. Those are the ones that I want to, look at a little bit more tightly. So rather than having to fish through everything, and that's really what this statistic means to me personally, is if there's that many alerts that an organization only looks at about half of them, you're probably there's too much static going on. It's hard to sift through all of that to pinpoint what's happening on your network. And when less than half of the half that you look at is legitimate, it becomes even easier for the criminals to gain access, and your response time takes even longer, which kind of pivots back to the last side from the Verizon report, saying that it can take months to years to figure out what's going on. This is why, because you're looking at so much and trying to figure out what's happening that you're really having to sift through and find the needle in the haystack rather than just looking at the needles in the first place. So it's kind of a different, train of thought from that, and it really allows the hackers to leverage those classic attacks. So they can come in, they can use the social engineering attacks, they can use the spam, they can do targeted phishing. They can hit specific groups of people. They have all the time in the world to target your organization, where you don't have all the time in the world to either A, be able to respond or to defend against them. And CSOs, chief security officers, cite budget constraints, compatibility issues, and lack of trained talent. I would imagine if you asked anybody in IT right now, they could probably give you all three of those, regardless of it just being security. But I don't know many organizations out there that don't have budget constraints. That's just always something that we're living in, and normally we don't have the amount of people that we really need to get the job done anyway. So that just kind of seems to me the commonality of just IT in general. So it does point to, coming out of this report, that a lot of the things that we're doing and not doing allow those classic attacks, those social engineering attacks, to be very successful against a lot of these systems. So let's talk about some of the challenges and what's been done and what some of these organizations have had real issues with. So when we talk about multi-factor authentication, MFA, so from an MFA perspective, it really is knowing your password and then having another piece of item. Nowadays, it's a smartphone application that allows you to either approve or deny the interaction with the system. But how do you implement that effectively? A lot of times what organizations will start with is it's a security mandate that it's going to come down and it's going to be pushed out to all of the users. It's not necessarily one of those things that's driven with the end user in mind. It always stems from, this is where we're going to do it. We're going to force feed this. And from a flow perspective or understanding the workflows, organizations can end up inundating their employees or their constituents with MFA. A couple of months ago, actually, I think it's probably been close to a year ago now, I was at a conference presenting, and it was a smaller conference, so we were just kind of sitting around a room, and it was unique because when you talk about MFA challenges and being inundated with those, there were two people sitting next to each other in the conference, and one of them actually got an MFA request. Well, their phones were pretty identical, but one of them wasn't on the table, and the person next to him just grabbed the phone and approved it. They used the same MFA provider, had similar phones, but the funny part was he approved the other person's MFA sitting there at the table. It's like, oops, at that particular point, MFA is not providing a value anymore. It is just basically a stepping stone of somebody getting in the way. And when you talk about the challenges and the way I like to get into them, when you're implementing a security model, regardless of what you're doing, you need the end user to understand the value. They've got to understand the security value. Otherwise, you're going to have big issues with how you're implementing that. And when we talk about going back to that enterprise initiative of we're going to force out MFA, a lot of times they don't take the end user into effect and what that end user is doing. I've talked to numerous organizations that have attempted to do MFA and had large constituents of retired people. How are you going to give them, their tokens or their codes? Are you going to email them? Are you going to text them? Okay, well, we can text them. Well, then they don't have texting plans on their phone, and they get very agitated because they had to pay 10 cents for the text and all of these type of things. So once again, now rather than engaging your end user, you're irritating your end user. So it needs to be thought about from that end user engagement, how to implement it effectively and what steps to go through to keep that balance and the understanding of this is what you need to do from a security perspective. Let's keep you engaged, but let's not, tip the scales the other way where it just becomes, something that we're doing. We're just clicking a button to get past our MFA. When we talk about single sign-on, that's another one of the engagements that a lot of organizations are looking at, one, to help provide with social engineering attacks. And if you think about it, it's because, well, then you have one spot to stop them. You can turn off the account. You can change things. So it does make it a little bit easier from that perspective. And it also is one of those scenarios where when we talk about MFA, I have this conversation quite frequently where somebody will say, well, we're going to provide our MFA at our single sign-on solution. Okay, that's an option. It's not necessarily the best option. One of the reasons that I don't think it's the best option is because normally not all of your accounts are inside of your SSO solution or your identity management solution. The highest privileged accounts that are going to access your PeopleSoft system are going to use some two-tier connections or get in a different way. So the highest privileged accounts are going to be not MFA. So it's basically an admin style account that's not going to have MFA. That's not a great solution. You need to be able to provide it across the board to everybody. And when you look at the enterprise firewalls, they become a little challenged with especially ERP applications or metadata driven applications such as PeopleSoft. They're not static web pages. They don't exist on a URL where somebody can just go out there and navigate to it and say, this is where somebody's going. They're very robust, wonderful applications. They're very powerful. They do a lot of great jobs, but they're challenging from that security model of an enterprise firewall. They don't necessarily know, where things are located, what they're doing. They can't filter things different. It's not static as some of the other web applications are. So when you talk about that, it becomes a little bit difficult. And when you think about stolen credentials, especially versus some of these setups, is from an enterprise perspective, when somebody steals the credentials, it's going to work out from the scenario of, you're going through these steps. They get a hold of those credentials. Your firewall is going to allow them in because they're putting in, credentials that are valid inside of your system. So they're going to end up getting through, and what you're going to end up with is that user is now in your enterprise system, going through all of your different, enterprise firewalls and those type things because they had valid credentials. So that's one of the reasons why when we talk about social engineering attacks, they're so critical, is because the hackers work on an ROI just like everybody else does. And they figured out that they don't have to have the most advanced zero-day attack when people are willing to give up their credentials. And I say willing, it's not necessarily willing, it's by accident. Majority of the time, people don't fall for them on purpose. It is an accident. If you look at some of the studies done by CERT and some of the other different organizations, the busier people are, the higher probability that they're going to fall for a social engineering attack. It's just the way it is. Whether it's a phishing attack or somebody calling on the phone, what they want to do is they want to get it off of their to-do list. So when you think about that, somebody gets an email, it's coming in, they've got a big list of things that they need to check off for the day. So immediately, I can click and be done with that. They click off, done. And now that's off their to-do list. They don't have to worry about it. Problem was that was a targeted phishing attack against them. Their credentials are now lost. Somebody's going to be accessing the system as them, trying to steal their, paycheck, or trying to steal identities out of the organization, so on and so forth. So what happens with that is when those credentials are stolen, there is an effect on the security inside of the organization. There a big effect. And, from the end user's perspective, what really happens for them is they're going to get their network user ID and password reset. It's going to be changed. Okay, well, now everything needs to go away. Not necessarily, because what happens inside of your organization is there's a big ramification inside of your organization. There's going to be help desk. They've got to reset the password in numerous places. Some security analyst is going to have to go in and try to figure out what was done. Did this user, acting as, the other person, gain access to anything that they shouldn't have been able to see? Was there any data leakage? Was there any, stolen data? Did we have a minor little breach of maybe even just a couple of records or of this individual's record? All of this has to be done. I was at a conference about 6 weeks ago and I was talking about this specifically, and there was a person in the back of the room, and I asked this question of how long does it take to go through this process when somebody in your organization falls for a phishing attack? How long does it take inside of your security group to go through and really go through all that landscape and figure out what was done or not done, or if you have any issues? And she replied, over a week. So when you think about that, the end user may look at it and say, oh, well, I gave away my credentials. It's a 2-second fix. Well, there was a security analyst on the back end that was spending longer than a week dealing with what that did to the organization. Was there any breach? Was anything accessed? So from that perspective, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with that Cisco report of data and logging. You've got to make sure that you have the right data and the right information, because when you're trying to do it after the fact, if you don't have that information, it's just going to extrapolate and increase the amount of time that it takes to see in and understand what was done. So there are a lot of effects on the security inside of the organization, and it's getting your end users to understand that through, training and understanding and all of those other type of things. So when we get into patching and maintenance, policies, procedures, all of those type things, a lot of times from an organizational perspective, you will see, and we will recommend this exactly like Oracle does, apply your CPUs, the critical patch updates, make sure you're applying those. Have that inside of your policies and procedures that you're going to do them in X period of time. You also need to verify that it's done. If you look back at the Equifax breach, for example, it really came from an unpatched server. Well, the guy thought it was patched. When something happened to the process and the server was exposed. That's also one of those things of doing your due diligence. It's making sure you have your policies and procedures in place. What are you going to do? Should people be able to take data out of PeopleSoft, for example? Should they be able to run a grid to Excel? Should they be able to run a query to Excel? What happens in that scenario? Where is that data going? Can your organization protect it in the same way? If somebody gets a hold of one of those accounts in a phishing attack, now that data is going to leave your entire environment, not just be stored on a drive somewhere. So it's, something to be concerned about. So when we talk about layered security as a whole, there's a few different things that I like to start with. One of them being the CIS20. The CIS20 controls, it used to be kind of like the OWASP top 10 and some other things like that. Well, what they did, they kind of consolidated these down into a list of 20 controls. The reason I like these is they bring up very good thoughts in a process of what you should do from a security perspective. The nice part is it doesn't tell you which tool you're supposed to use or how you're supposed to solve this. It allows you as an organization to solve your own problems the way that it's fit for you, but it tells you the things that you should be worried about and gives you ideas and what you should be looking at from the protection perspective. So it's broken out into a couple of main different controls. One of them is the basic ones, and then it steps up into foundational and organizational. Obviously, those are different scope if you want to think about it from that perspective, but it does give you the ideas of how you need to start protecting your environments. Interestingly enough, we've got some state organizations that we've heard from that if the public institutions or the public organizations inside of that state aren't working to implement the CIS20 controls, that if there is a breach at one of those organizations, they will not protect them. So from that particular perspective, it is something that some organizations are taking very, very seriously. When we talk about how we can help with the CIS20 controls specifically, our application security platform fills in about 9 of the controls specifically inside of your PeopleSoft system. So we help stop all of these or work with those very quickly so it can give you a jump start on what's going on. That's why I talk about a layered security, because when you look at the situation of what's going on, there is no one silver bullet that's going to answer all of these things. You have to build a layered security model to be able to protect against that. When we look at our platform, we designed the platform with 3 main focus areas, I'll call them that. So when you look at it, the application security platform is made up of intrusion prevention, data loss prevention, and incident response. Why did we name the areas that? One, it's to align with enterprise security initiatives. So when you look at intrusion prevention, what we're talking about there is allowing integration with single sign-on, for example. So any SAML-based or ADFS style identity management system, we can plug and play with into your PeopleSoft system. So it allows deeper integration with the enterprise security initiatives. There's no customizations that you have to do to make that work. Also, implementation of multi-factor authentication, to keep the bad guys out, or to go through that stepped up authentication when those high privileged users are accessing your system and they're going to request to do something. You can build in protections. We can also enforce a whitelisting. What should users be able to access when they're on the public internet versus sitting at their office or in their desk? Those are 2 different areas. When you have a PeopleSoft administrator and they're accessing from home, should they be able to see 100% of what they do at their desk? Probably not. They should be enforced to a least privileged access to where they only see their self-service model, unless there's some business reason why they need to be able to do it, which maybe you need to enforce connection to a VPN and all these other steps to be able to do that. When we get into the data loss prevention side, this is allowing you to protect your sensitive data. And I say your sensitive because it really is your organizational data. The nice part is you can pick and choose what those fields are. It's not a one size fits all. It doesn't have to be the same thing that somebody else is protecting. So if you have built custom pages, records, components that might be capturing sensitive data, you've defined your own fields, you can protect that data. You can pick and choose how it gets presented to the user contextually. If they're on your network or if they're off your network, maybe there's different levels of masking. You can do a partial mask, complete mask. You can do that by roles, for example. It's very customizable, very configurable to allow you to choose how you want your end users to interact with that sensitive data. Once again, it's the data you define. It's not just given to you by X number of fields. It's really any field. When we get into the incident response layer, this is when we talk about understanding that 360-degree what's going on inside of the PeopleSoft system. What are my users touching? What are they looking at? You know, it sure can tell you what you know, where people have gone, but it also can tell you what people have viewed. So when they access the page and then they get out, they don't do anything on it. Yes, we can log that. We can understand that. So it does help with the detection and forensics of breaches. It also helps with compliance and audit support. So when you're talking about some of these international issues, GDPR, you know, the California Privacy Act, you know, there's also somebody who's come up with, you know, submitting a national act here in the United States that would be very similar to a GDPR with the same type of penalties and all of those other type of things. Regardless, we know it's going to come soon. You know, a lot of government organizations have already implemented, and it's going to end up at some sort of national level here soon in the U.S. So when we talk about the platform as a whole, one of the things that it does is it allows you to build in the security model that makes sense for your organization. It doesn't have to be the same. So, you know, however many people are on this call, everybody has a different security initiative. Everybody has different goals. Somebody might be working with MFA. Somebody might be doing SSO. Somebody might be doing a combination of the both of those. Then they want to implement data masking. The nice part is you pick and choose what profile hits your organization and can help protect your organization the best. So it's, you know, tailored contextual security to protect your system against social engineering and breaches and hacks. So how do we do this? When we work within the PeopleSoft system, we are actually a plugin that sits inside the PeopleSoft web server. So because of that, we're able to see the traffic going in and out of the web server. Because of that, we're able to do different things and to apply security events to those transactions as they're occurring. So for example, one of our actions is a block. A block literally does just that. It's not going to allow that transaction to happen. So maybe I'll build up my rule based upon pieces of conditions. So somebody coming in external and accessing the query administration tool, for example. So if they come in external trying to access Query Manager, what we're going to do is we're going to block that transaction from ever occurring. You know, it's going to show them a message. That message is going to let them know why they can't get into Query Manager, and they're going to be able to know exactly what's going on. It's not going to institute a call to the help desk because they're going to know why. If we want to change that style of security or the rule, we could swap out the action and we could actually do a redirect to implement multi-factor authentication. So when we talk in that scenario, they come in the exact same way, coming in external, they try to get to Query Manager. What we're going to do is we're going to invoke a multi-factor challenge. Once they pass that multi-factor challenge, then they can gain access to the application very easily. You know, you can implement both of these within the same exact system, once again, layered. So you can pick and choose how this is going to protect your system. We also do very detailed logging, very targeted logging, or very broad-based logging inside of the application. All of our configuration is built inside of PeopleSoft. So all the records, pages, and components that are required are installed into the database, and all of those are used to configure the rules. The nice part about it is that allows you access to PeopleSoft attributes. Think those menus, pages, components, roles, user IDs. All of those type things can be used as conditions to look for events inside of the system that you want to protect against. So let's go ahead and jump out to demo. I'm going to reconfigure my screen just a little bit here. Pull this out of the way. So what I want to do is I am going to start with signing in as a PeopleSoft system to a self-service, low-privileged user. You know, think of this as, you know, one of your normal employees just coming in to do benefits, look at a paycheck, any sort of scenario like that. One of the things that you want to protect against in that scenario is as a PeopleSoft administrator, the owner of the data, a business manager, you've got a couple of different ways that you can look at the data. Number one is I need to protect my end constituent. Well, they're going to access their own data. So if they make mistakes, say they fall for a phishing attack or something like that, they're going to end up having their identity stolen. So you have to protect the individual account as well as those high privileged accounts that have access to the total enterprise data. The nice part about that is these protections are easy to build in with our application security platform. So what I've done in this scenario is created a rule that masks out the social security number. It's very, nice, specific. I can do a complete mask, partial mask. You pick and choose how you want this implemented. The nice part about it is there's no modification to the record page or component to make this work. It all occurs at our rules engine level. So when you're talking about updates, fixes, those type things, you do a compare report, there's never a change to this page. So it makes it very easy to maintain this because you can do it at a rules level and you're not having to modify your PeopleSoft system. The nice part is, this just happens to be the one field that I picked. I could have easily picked a bunch of different fields. Going back to the scenario of how to implement multi-factor efficiently, one of the things that I hear a lot of attacks about is somebody accessing the direct deposit page. They get a hold of somebody's account, they phish them, targeted phishing, however they get a hold of the account or those credentials, they log in. They're going to attempt to update the account number inside of PeopleSoft in an attempt to steal the paycheck. So in this scenario, what we've done is a very targeted multi-factor implementation. So rather than masking or attempting to stop somebody from getting to this page, we've allowed them to the page. But what we've done is we've implemented and layered our security model. So you have the data loss prevention with the intrusion prevention, so you can protect that account field. Very targeted multi-factor. The user only has to, go through it when they want to view the account number. So if they want to do that, I've got this system configured with Duo. I'm going to click the link, and slowly, Duo is going to respond. All right, let me try that again. There we go. So the Duo window is going to come into play. I can select my phone, and what I'm going to do is a push notification. And on my phone, I get the notification, and I can either approve or deny that. Once I approve it, I gain access into the account number. So right there, it's very targeted. We've had several organizations who have implemented this from an MFA perspective. They've had the end users call their help desk requesting additional MFA on other certain pages. So when you have your end users calling the help desk asking for more MFA, you're winning that battle of understanding, why the MFA is there and putting it into a situation where the end user sees the security value of that protecting their data. That's really the end goal. It's one of the things that I don't like about just challenging somebody every time they go into an application, because not necessarily everything they do is going to be sensitive. So from that perspective, it's very streamlined, very efficient. You can really put it anywhere in the application on any field. I just happen to do the account number in this situation. So let's go ahead and sign out. One of the things that I wanted to do is flip over to a higher privileged account, because there's a couple of things that we've done here as well to be able to protect against this situation. One of the scenarios that you'll see is somebody's going to attempt to go in and look at the amount of data or what somebody's got access to. I just wanted to do modify a person. So I'm going to go ahead and open up that record, any record. I'm just going to happen to pick Douglas Lewis here. So when I'm looking at Douglas's record, what's going to happen, and this kind of protects you against both the inside and the outside, because what you're looking at is a data mask, but it's a click to view. So that default data is taken off. So if I go down and look at the national ID, for example, what's going to happen is the social security number is not there. It's very similar to what you saw on that fluid page, but what we've done here is if the user wants to see the data, they can then click it and understand and see that data. The nice part is we're going to track that. We've written that out to a log. We understand exactly what that user did. Another thing that a lot of organizations are doing, especially from implementing that, but especially from trying to contain data, is this is a grid of national IDs, for example. So if I'm a hacker, I want to steal this data, I know the PeopleSoft system well enough. I can click the download to Excel link, and what's going to happen is that data is going to open in Excel. What happens here, though, is we've stepped in the way of that process. We don't allow that to take place. So we're going to tell the user, this is kind of an example of one of our block rules. So we're going to tell that user why they're not able to do that process. The downloading of sensitive data is not allowed. That's it, pure and simply. They can't do it anymore. So we're stopping it in before it even occurs. So if somebody tries to take that data out and do something with it, they're not going to be able to do it. One of the areas that we see a lot of attacks try to pivot to, though, is really something of very high value. Let's start with query, for example. So from the reporting tools, if I drill into query, I'm going to go to Query Manager. What you're going to see here is I've got a very targeted MFA as well. So I've got a high privileged user. If they fall for an attack, they give up their credentials, we can protect that data. We can stop people from being able to exfiltrate a lot of data out of the system very simply by putting in a rule. I can do that push notification. Once I approve that, I'm going to fall directly into the Query Manager. So it allows me to understand, our application security platform, understands the real differences of what the users attempted to do in the system. From that self-service user, it was to show them a field. Here, it was to allow them into Query Manager. We get that context. We know where they're going, and we're going to bring them right back to what they were doing after that MFA challenge. If they pass the MFA challenge, let me put it that way. So it allows you to protect the areas of the application that you really want to protect. So one of the things that we talk about frequently too is building out challenges based upon maybe different user IDs. So for example, PS, it's an all high privileged account. In finance, it would be a VP1 style account. So what you'll see here is immediately I challenge for multi-factor at logon with this one. So you can do those MFA challenges differently based upon who the user is, what context they're coming in, maybe where they're coming in from, what they're doing inside of the application, where they're looking at, or specifically, hey, this is a really high privileged account. A couple of years ago when we were talking about the token smoke, and a lot of times they would rebuild that token with the PS account, you would never actually see the user ID and password dialog. Well, if you had multi-factor implemented this way, it would stop that from happening, because regardless of how they authenticate, whether they use single sign-on, PeopleSoft authentication, regardless of any of those steps, you're going to come in and you're going to have to pass that contextual-based MFA inside the application. One of the things when we talk about social engineering attacks specifically, though, is also understanding what's going on, what's actually being looked at, who's doing what inside of the application. One of the things we may see most frequently is like a brute force style attack. And I just updated my analytics database, so there's not a lot of data in here, so I apologize for that. But one of the things that what we're looking at here is really being able to understand failed and successful logins. So if you think about that, what it allows you to understand is, maybe I'm going through a brute force attack. I can look at this by network login. So where was this coming from? It allows you to quickly see where all of your failed passwords were coming from. So if you look at it from the perspective of, I know some organizations that have been hit with about 3,500 logins a minute that were failing. Their Active Directory systems were having a hard time keeping up with the authentication requests. This would tell you exactly what's going on, because it would look at that, it would see, oh, we've got a bunch of failed attempts. It's all coming from a particular IP address. We need to make sure that that's stopped, and blocked. One of the other things that you can also do is look at successful logins, because it's important to be able to see the flip side of that. Because it's one of those scenarios that, okay, who didn't get in, but you also want to understand who did get in and who understands the access of, say maybe you have the PS login is turned off and it's not enabled, but you all of a sudden come in and look and there was a successful login by the PS account or some other high privileged account. This is one of those scenarios where you need to understand, wow, they did get in. Okay, where did that happen from? So we kind of have geo maps of all of those scenarios. One of the other things that we find a lot of in dealing with incident response is that understanding of what was done from inside of the system, who's done what access. So if you have a user, frequently I was dotted line to the CISO, and I would get the request of, okay, we think this person gave up their credentials. We want to look at all of their access between 8 and 10 a.m. at this particular day. Can you tell me what was done? Well, it's very difficult to be able to do that when you don't have the data. And that's one of the big situations that becomes an issue when you're talking about dealing with social attacks, because you have to deal with a lot of them. And how long does it take you to respond to each one? So if we look at this, obviously I've got some PS, I have PS1, I've got VSIN. I can definitely understand what those users have done. I can filter specifically by one of them. So let me look at VSIN's records, for example. This is all based upon sensitive, so she didn't access any sensitive information. So if I flip back over to PS1, they accessed personal data 1, job data, all of those personal related records. So what we're doing is we're boiling it up, adding intelligence to only look at the things that are of interest. If it doesn't contain sensitive information, do I really want to be concerned about it as much as something that contains very sensitive information? So the nice part is you can boil that up and find that very quickly. You can also search by time ranges. One of the things that we find additional is, did somebody attempt to take information out of your PeopleSoft system? So here we can look at going back to that grid where somebody attempted to download that data out. I can tell you exactly who the user was, what type of data did they download. What we've done is we've tiered this in the difference of private versus sensitive data. That goes back to the PPI, the private personal information layers of 1 versus 2. So in that situation, we can narrow that down for you. So if somebody doesn't understand the PeopleSoft system, a security analyst can look at this and understand, oh, hey, this user was attempting to download very private data and they were offshore, or they did successfully download it, those type scenarios. It allows you to close that loop at a much quicker point than, years to months in some of those scenarios. When we talk about looking at the sensitive data views, one of the things that we've got here, and this is really from some of the compliance of our different organizations dealing with GDPR, is understanding who's looking at sensitive data, because you have to be able to track that, not just who updated it, but who viewed it. So we can look at that by different user IDs. So if you think about multiple different clerks in an organization, you may have, HR clerks, you may have financial aid clerks, you may have benefits, where you have 5, 10 different people that are in the system looking at sensitive data every day. You want to be able to track and understand how they're using that data and how frequently they look at it. Also from IP addresses. So going back to that scenario of somebody fell for a phishing attack. They've got their, we know what IP address they came in from. Let me see if that IP address looked at any data. So if I look at this 103 number, what it's going to do is it tells me all of the different data that particular IP address looked at. So it was the user ID, the employee ID. So these are all the different employee IDs that were accessed by this IP address. Very easy to, cut that down and figure out exactly what was done. And then when you want to look at it from how the data was accessed or whose data was accessed, I just happened to look at, I think it was KU001 when I was in the system right there. So I can see exactly whose data I looked at. Let me do a 30-minute window. And there's the one row that I actually just looked at inside of this last, webinar. So immediately I can see exactly who was looked at. So you can close that loop when you're talking about that, not in months to years, but in minutes to seconds. You can understand exactly what's going on. You can have response to that. You can figure out whether somebody exposed data or didn't expose data. So I'm going to flip back over here to the PowerPoint. So what I wanted to let you know, in wrapping up, and there's a couple of questions that I'll get to here in just a second. Social engineering can be dealt with very quickly. What happens is you have to have that understanding, and you've got to put the layers of security into place beforehand. It can't be something that you wait to do after, because if you're trying to do it after, it becomes very difficult to construct what happened. But if you put the right logging, you protect your data, you mask the data in the right ways, what you're going to find out is you're going to have less and less social engineering, because they're going to figure out that they can't get to your data, and they're going to go to somebody else who hasn't put in these protections. So existing security challenges, trying to integrate with MFA. What's the correct way to do it? What's the correct way to do a single sign-on implementation? What initiatives are we trying to do? Not all of those have to be so difficult to do. You can implement them. You can work with your security groups together to come up with a very secure PeopleSoft application, to defend against multiple layers of attacks, and you don't necessarily know what's going to happen in the future. Going back to kind of that reference of the token schmoken from a couple of years ago, that kind of came up out of the blue. You don't necessarily know what the hackers are going to do in the future. So you want to be able to make sure that you protect your system in a way that allows you to, control how your data is exposed, control how your users are interacting, implementing, security rules that are effective against your system in a manner that protects the data, but in a way that makes it to where the users can see and understand why they're having to go through those events. So when we talk about questions, which I believe is the next one, one of the things that I wanted to say is if there is something that you do want to follow up with, you can always email info@appsien.com. One of the things that we did have a couple of questions come through, and one of them was, do we recommend Splunk for analyzing the web server logs? Really, when you're talking about the web server logs, you can utilize any SIM. The hardest problem that we've seen with most organizations is coming up with the correlation and building of the understanding of what's actually happening within those logs. We decided to build our analytics platform inside of Splunk because one of the things is, one, it was easy for us to work with because our logs are very targeted in a lot of scenarios, so we're able to control a lot of the data that's going in. So it's not going to be this massive implementation of gigs and gigs and gigs of data going in there a day. It's very targeted, streamlined, efficient. It was something that we could work within. So that was one of the reasons why you see us working with Splunk inside of our dashboards and our analytics. So with that, I just wanted to thank you for your attendance today. I hope you found this session informative. If you do have any questions that you want to follow up with, you can email info@appsien.com, and we will definitely follow up and make sure you get answers to that. So I appreciate the attendance today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.